Welcome back. This is Chris Fulton, Advisory Solution Consultant with ServiceNow, and in this episode I'm going to talk about the automated test framework that's new in the Istanbul release of ServiceNow. As you go through and adopt either fixes within ServiceNow or major releases such as Istanbul or Jakarta or any of those coming down the pipe, you'll need to do testing and make sure that all your functionality continues to work. Also, you're going to test your functionality as you make any changes to your system. So you may add a new form, add additional fields, add some logic to do some automation or processing, and you want to test those. And often you can do that by having your users test that. But the automated test framework is a way that you can build reusable tests that execute automatically in your environment once they're kicked off. The tests are executed in a programmatic fashion. The results are presented back to you as the tester, along with screenshots showing all the success and any failures that may have occurred along the way. So that's the purpose of this video, so let's jump into it. As we go down the menu, you see there's Client Test Runner, Test Queue, and Suite Queue. The Test Queue and Suite Queue are exactly what they sound like. They're queues that hold the list of tests and suites that'll be executing. We'll look a little bit more at the tests and suites as we get into this, but it's important to note that one test runs at a time. This is not a parallel test execution. It's not used for anything such as testing the load on the system, and only one of these client test runners can be running at one time. A client test runner is essentially the web interface where the test will run in real time, and it'll make more sense as we get into the demo and you can see how it interacts with the test being executed. So let's look at a test and we'll jump into this. This is all data, as I mentioned, from the plugin. So if you load the plugin and you load the demo data, you'll get access to all these tests that I'm walking through as well. They're all examples, they're not real world, so you want to test those with your instance, but let's walk through this and see how this works. So at the top we just have a name and a description and active, which is checked. As we get to the bottom, you'll see that for this specific UI test called Basic UI Test, there are 4 steps, and those steps execute in what is called the execution order. So you notice that there's a numeric value here which indicates what order these steps will be ran. There's also the test results tab. It's empty right now because we haven't ran this test yet. As we run the test, you'll see the results appear here. It's pretty self-explanatory when you read the test steps. The first thing we're going to do is impersonate, and the description gets filled in automatically. It's pretty explanatory. We're going to impersonate a user called atf.user. Then we're going to open a form against the table called catalog task. We're going to set some field values. So you can see here assign to equals ATF user, short description and description. And then lastly, we're going to submit the form. So that's what's going to execute in this test. And we'll run this in a second and see that in action. Something else that's important to note is that as these tests are executed, it's actually doing work within your instance. What's really cool about the automated test framework is that once the test is complete, whether it fails or passes, we will then turn back anything that was executed in the instance. In fact, if you were to go to create an incident or a problem within the system as part of your testing, once that test is complete, you won't find any record of it within your instance. So we clean up after ourselves very well, and that's pretty helpful from a testing performance or testing tool standpoint. So let's go ahead and run this test. And when I select run the test, it's going to come up and it's going to give us some information. I can see that this icon is spinning. It is in the running state. The next thing I see is it's waiting for a browser to pick up this test. That is where the client test runner comes in. So the client test runner is essentially a browser window where this test will execute. And if I choose click here, it's going to open up another browser window. And this is the client test runner. You'll watch and you can see in real time as the test is executing. We'll see what's happening. We can watch and see if there's any errors on the screen. You don't have to watch this, We're going to take screenshots for you and place that in the results of the test. But if you want to watch it, you're able to do that. The client test runner can run across any browser. So if you want to do this same test in Internet Explorer and then Firefox and then Safari and compare the results, certainly you can do that. So the test is completed. I can see here in the upper right hand corner that I'm connected. So it's actually being connected back to the instance. I'm executing as the system administrator, and it's executed a test one time. And the current status is it's waiting for the next test. I didn't have any other tests in my queue, so the test runner will just sit here and wait for that. I could close this window, or I could leave it open for the next test to execute. When I come back here, you can see that the test was executed. It says all steps passed in 27 seconds, and I'll go to the results. It's going to take me to the results page for this specific test. And at the top, you'll see these attachments. These are the screenshots of each of the steps that I can see and make sure what happened in that test. So if there were any failures or something that wasn't expected, I'll see what that result was. And that's why I mentioned you don't have to watch the client test runner screen. We're going to capture those screenshots for you. We can also see the browser that was involved in this. And this is just grabbed from the browser itself. So the browser identifies what it is. And we can see that for this one, it's running on a Mac, and it's running Chrome and the specific version. Here are the test results. So for those 4 steps, I can see very quickly they were all successful, and the output is basically from the description of what that test was executing. All right, so now that we've seen an out-of-the-box demo script execute, let's create our own test and see how that works. So once I select Test from the Automated Test Framework menu, I'm going to go ahead and click New to create a new test. I'm going to give it a quick description. I'll go ahead and click Save. The form reloads, and now I have my related list at the bottom. Again, we have the test steps and the test results as related list, and I'm going to go ahead and start to add some test steps. You notice I have 2 options. I can add additional steps, or I can add from a template. A template is exactly as you might imagine. It is a set of steps that you create and then save and then apply to a test. So I may do the same thing every time, which is to impersonate a user, open a form, and set a field value. And in that case, if I had a template for that, I could apply the template and then continue to add steps beyond that. It'll just be a real time saver if you have some standard things that you do as part of your test. You don't have to use it, but it certainly is a valuable tool. I'm going to go ahead and do a test manually. And when I hit Add Step, you'll notice I bring up this dialog. There's 2 different types of or groups of test steps that we can do. There are server test steps, and so those are things like impersonating a user, logging data, recording or doing a query against a record. Then there are things we do on a form, such as opening a form, validating data on a form, submitting a form, and so forth. The first thing I'm going to do is impersonate a user. I'm logged in as a system administrator, but for this test, I want it to impersonate some other user. If I didn't impersonate, the test would run as the current logged in user, which in this case is the system admin. When I click that, you notice the execution order is already set for me. There's some read-only fields over here that are informational. I'm going to go ahead and execute this test or impersonate Chris G and Carly. I'll go ahead and submit that, and my test step has been saved. Let's go ahead and add a second step. When I do that, you'll notice that it defaulted back to this server category of steps. So you'll notice on this dialog that it'll default back to whatever your last selected value was, either server or form. In this case, I'm going to switch to form, and I'm going to say I want to open a new form. And when I select this, I'll have to tell it what table I want to open. In this case, we'll do an incident. And if there's a view of that form, a specific view that I want to open and test against, I can select that here. If I don't select that, it's going to be the default view for that user. I'll go ahead and submit that. So I've impersonated Chris, I've opened up an incident form, and now my next step is that I want to go to that form and set some field values. So I'm going to basically mimic filling in that form. So the first thing I want to do is set the short description to I need help. I'm going to set the assigned to as Beth England and submit this. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to validate some information about this form. You'll see as we scroll down here, after set field values, I can do things such as field value validation. So what that is saying is, maybe you have a business rule that kicks off when I assign this to Beth England that changes something else on the form. Maybe it sets it to a priority of 2 or whatever it might be. This is where I can validate that those things are actually executing under different test cases. So I could say field validation, and now I go in and specify the field name and what that validation should be. So in this case, I want to say I'm looking at the incident, the field of assigned to is Beth England. So I go ahead and submit that. And there's a validation now to say validate that the assigned to is Beth England. Now, since I said it in the prior step, hopefully it still is Beth England, but if we had some business logic that might be manipulating that, it could change. Another thing you can do is I can look for field state validation. So if you have different things that are modifying the read-only values or the visibility values of fields on your form, we can validate those. So here I can look and say, let's make sure that the short description and the assigned to are both visible. And I want to see that the, let's pick something here, correlation ID is not visible. And I'll go ahead and submit that. Notice there's other capabilities here as well. Pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. So now I've completed my test. I've gone in, I've added some different capabilities for this test that I want to execute. And what I can do now is I'll go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to immediately run that. Now, if you recall, we still have our client runner open here in this other window. So when I say run the test, it's not going to prompt me for a client runner window. It now says it's executing the test branches. And if I come over here, you'll see that indeed it is running that test in the same browser window. Once this test is complete, we'll take a look at the results and see if we were successful. You notice here it says rolling back changes that occurred during the test execution. So as I mentioned, as we're doing changes as part of a test, it's executing live in your instance. We're also going to roll those back and make sure that we don't change any data within your instance. So it's important to note that as the user that's executing this test, you're not doing things in other windows like adding records or modifying records, because we'll pick those up and could possibly roll those back as well. So in this case, we're complete. I'm going to go ahead and go to the results. We've already seen the top half of this form. Let's go to the bottom, and we see that everything is successful. I've gone ahead and made a quick change to this test now. This is the same test we just executed, but notice here at the bottom I said if the assigned to is not equal to Beth England, because I want to execute this and show you what a failure looks like. So after changing the test to force a failure and executing that test, this is the result. You can see that the test was executed, the test has failed, and now when I go to the test results, we'll see something a little bit different. In this case, I'm sorting on the execution order, so the first step is at the bottom, the last step is at the top. And we see here from the output that it was a failure in this step. The form did not match the condition, which is the assigned to is not equal to Beth England. So we just changed the logic there. In fact, if I want to see that step and validate what that looked like on the screen, if you click on Manage Attachments, the bottom attachment will always be the one that's the failure if you have a failure as your test results. When I click on View, and I zoom in, we can see indeed the assigned to is Beth Anglin, which is not what we wanted, so that's why this test has failed. So it's pretty simple to use the tests and the validations and the screenshots to understand what's happening in the environment. Of course, we could fix our form or change the logic or whatever we needed to do and execute this test as many times as required. And then, of course, have those tests be brought back into our overall test plan and make sure that we're executing against this as expected. So now that we've seen how tests are created and executed and you see the results, let's talk about how we put those tests into test suites. So I've gone ahead and selected suites here on the left-hand side, and you can see all the different test suites that are part of our demonstration data that you can load with your plugin. If I select one of these, you'll see that a suite is really nothing more than a parent-child relationship. The suite itself is the parent in most cases, and it can have child test suites. So we have something called mixed test suite, which is the parent in this case. And then we can see that it has a child called child G. If it had a parent, it would be noted here, so that's how I know that this is the actual parent. As an example of that, if I go into child G, which is a test suite, we notice that its parent is the mixed test suite. So it's just a way of nesting your different suites to build an overall test suite that matches your criteria. Once I've created a test suite that looks and executes how I want it to be, I can then go in and run the test suite from here. What we would see then is it would fill in our test queue and suite run queue, so we could see things that are put into the queue for execution. And of course, our test suite results would show up here, much like we saw when we executed just the individual tests. So that's all for now. As an introduction to the automated test framework, hopefully it gives you an idea of how it works and operates, and hopefully you'll get a chance to go into your instance and try this out. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Otherwise, have a great day.